Welcome back, students. Tonight, we are going to focus on the concept of classification in biology. Let's get started. When we look at all the living organisms on the planet, we see an almost unimaginable variety of shapes, sizes, characteristics, and features. If we, as biologists, want to study all of these different organisms, the most natural way to start is by classifying them, which means organizing them into groups in a logical manner. For biologists, classification is important for more than just keeping species organized. An organism's classification actually helps you understand the relationships that exist between that organism and all other living things. Let's look, for example, at the three species below. Let's say you were a field biologist and you were to encounter the middle organism, which is called an axolotl, in the wild. To begin to understand how it evolved and what other species it might be closely related to, you would refer to its classification. Some quick research would lead you to the fact that the axolotl is classified as an amphibian. By knowing its classification as an amphibian, you are able to determine that it is closely related by evolution to other amphibians, such as frogs and salamanders, which would give you some insight about the axolotl's physiology and behavior. The act of organizing living things is actually its own mini branch or type of science, which is known as taxonomy. So let's define it here. Taxonomy is the science and practice of classification. A scientist whose job it is to classify things is called a taxonomist. So let's imagine ourselves to be taxonomists for a second. If this were your job, then when a new species was discovered, you as the taxonomist would have to decide how to classify it. To begin with, you would have to keep in mind that modern taxonomy is based on evolutionary relationships. So, as the taxonomist, you would have to think about what evolutionary criteria you would want to consider before assigning a species to this kingdom or that kingdom, this family or that family, this genus or that genus, etc. There are four major criteria that you would consider. The first is the organism structures and function. Examples of structures and functions include things such as, does the organism have forelimbs? Does it have gills for breathing? Does it give birth to live offspring, or does it instead incubate and hatch eggs? Is it a producer or a consumer? Organisms are often, but not always, classified with other organisms that have similar structures and functions. The next thing that taxonomists look at is the organism's early stages of development. For example, looking at an adult mouse compared to an adult human, you might not think that they are in any way closely related. However, if you look at the developing mouse embryo, which I've actually have pictured here in the bottom left, and you compare it to the human embryo, which is pictured right next to it on the right, you can hardly tell the difference between these two species. The similarities in early stages of development reveal a closer evolutionary relationship between the two organisms than is initially apparent by looking at the adult forms of these organisms. The third criterion that taxonomists would consider is ancestry. In other words, looking at the fossil record and finding similarities between the species you are trying to classify and between the species that have existed in the past. A familiar example is how structural evidence from fossils helped taxonomists classify birds as closely related to dinosaurs. The final criterion that taxonomists would consider when classifying an organism is DNA evidence. This is the newest criterion, but it has proved incredibly valuable to taxonomists, and today is probably the criterion that is most heavily relied upon for making decisions about classification based on an evolutionary relationship. That's why I have it highlighted there in red. We will study DNA in depth this year, but for now, just know that DNA acts as a code, and organisms with lots of similarities in their DNA codes are closely related and therefore classified together. Let's continue with a little history of biological classification. Our modern classification system was established in the 1700s by a Swedish botanist named Carolus Linnaeus. So, at the time, there were other systems of classification in existence and other scientifically minded folk trying to organize our understanding of the world's species. However, Linnaeus is the one that provided the first system of classification that was consistent in its standards and yet flexible enough to accommodate new species as they were discovered. In the time since Linnaeus began his work in the 1700s, our system of classification has undergone many changes, and actually it continues to be modified and changed even to this day as biologists continue to make new discoveries about the Earth's species. If you look to the right, you see in this picture, hopefully, something that looks familiar to you that shows our modern system of classification. In this system of classification, organisms are grouped by commonalities into increasingly smaller and more specific groups. And the word that we use in this case for these different groups, which we've named kingdom, phylum, class, etc., we call all of these groups or levels taxa, which is a plural. The singular is taxon. So I hope that you have previously studied the names and orders of the 8 taxa that you see here. They are starting from the most encompassing, the most broad, the domain, which is not shown in this picture because it is the newest taxon. And then from there, we go to kingdom, and then phylum, which is more specific, and then down to class. And each time we're getting more specific about the criteria that's required to be at each level. Then order, family, genus, and species. So we will practice with these taxa in class, getting to know the order and how they're arranged relative to each other. Let's end today by discussing scientific naming. You may have noticed when you read a scientific book or article that organisms are sometimes referred to by long, sciencey, difficult to pronounce names that are different than the common name you might typically use to identify the organism. Well, that long, sciencey sounding name is what we call the organism's scientific name, which was created using the system of binomial nomenclature. Binomial nomenclature is a 2-word scientific naming system that scientists use to identify all species. And as you may have guessed, binomial nomenclature doesn't use English, it uses Latin. If you pick apart this vocabulary term, you might circle the prefix bi at the front. That prefix means 2. And then you might see in this part of the word nomial, something, if you take Spanish, similar to the word nombre. This word means name. So we have a 2 name And then nomenclature means naming system, so a two-name naming system. So let's take a look at an example here. Here's an organism, Smilodon californicus, which is the name of the organism you see in the background of this slide. The two words that make up the name each have their own purpose. The first word in the name indicates the organism's genus. And then the second name indicates the species to which the organism belongs. Hopefully you have studied these terms genus and species before, but if you haven't, here's a reminder. The term genus is just a group of similar species. Whereas when we use the term species, what we mean is a group of organisms that are capable of breeding and producing fertile offspring. What this means is that for two organisms to be considered part of the same species, they must be able to make babies that can then grow up and make babies of their own, which is another way of saying that they're fertile. For example, both dogs and wolves are part of the species Lupus because a dog and a wolf could have puppies that grow up to be adults that could then have more puppies. In contrast, a horse and a donkey are similar enough to be placed in the same genus, but they are not part of the same species because their offspring, which you may know is a mule, mules are sterile, which is they can't have their own babies. Okay, so back to our Smilodon californicus example. This organism goes by a common name, saber-toothed cat. Now, one more thing before we go on, I want you to notice some details about the way a scientific name is written. So first, the genus name is always capitalized. The second word, the species name, is always lowercase. And finally, both words in the name should be italicized. When writing scientific names, please make sure to follow these rules. All right, that's it for tonight. Thank you for listening and for taking notes, and I will see you in class tomorrow to review some of this material and dive into it a little bit deeper. Have a great night.